everyone's aware, we typically record these sessions and put them on YouTube. So please, if you would like to keep your camera off, please do keep your camera off. Or otherwise, do feel free to drop out if you're not comfortable with the recording taken. In the past, we have had an interpreting in the sessions so that people could ask questions in Welsh. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to get an interpreter today, so we won't be able to take questions in Welsh. But if anyone would like to ask one offline afterwards, please do feel free to send us an email. With that, I will kick off. So welcome everyone to our Digital Landscape Review Show and Tell today. This will actually be our last show and tell of this iteration of the Digital Landscape Review, as we are very close to the finish, but we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. Henry, if people just keep joining, do you mind just accepting them, admitting them as they join? Thanks. So just briefly what we're going to cover today, I'm going to start by just giving a brief recap of the landscape review and what we've kind of covered over the last actually 10 months through a few different phases. I'm then going to pass over to Henry Wright, who's going to talk to us about what we found on shared or common technology in use across public services. And then I'm going to hand over to Roshan, who's going to talk to us about local authority services, which we've looked at from the eye of which could make, which have the greatest opportunity to form exemplar services. And then finally, I will finish off just talking about what next as we come to the end of the beta phase of the landscape review. As a very quick recap, this is just who we are at CPS. So this is our mission statement. We are here to support Wales to deliver better digital public services sustainably. And that's closely aligned with what we've been doing in the landscape review, trying to understand how digital services are currently delivered. This is our team today. Unfortunately, we have apologies from Hannah, Antonio and Neris, but everyone else on the team is presenting today. A brief recap of the mission of the Digital Landscape Review. So we set out to uncover the most significant challenges currently present in digital services, and then to make the case that we should work together to tackle them. So we've gone out, we've spoken to a huge number of public services across Wales now. We want to understand kind of how digital services are currently being delivered and where there might be opportunities for us to work together maybe in a slightly different way, and opportunities for us to tackle some of those challenges. Just then, as a brief recap, as we look back over the landscape review, so we started actually in September 2021. We started with a discovery where we met with a small number of digital services. I think it was 15 across the landscape, and we started to understand from them how they were approaching their digital services, and we started to develop a framework for assessing digital services and organisations delivering them. We then moved on to the alpha, I think in November 2021, where we started to survey the landscape kind of at scale. So we went out and I think spoke to, it was I think about 25 organisations over the course of the alpha. And at that point, we were particularly looking for a representative sample of services so that we could get an understanding of how services across the board were actually operating and working at that time. In the beta, we both then took our landscape review further, and we have now spoken to more than 50 organisations across Wales, and we started to particularly think about how we prioritise the challenges that we'd uncovered and think about how we'd actually go about tackling them together. We're now just coming to the end of that beta phase, and in our final 6 weeks, we have been looking at 2 questions in a little bit more detail. And that's what we're going to talk about mostly today. So the first question is, where is the same software being used across services, or potentially where it's even being shared in the same instance? And then what are the benefits and risks of that happening, and maybe where is it happening, and maybe what are the blockers to it not happening in other places? And then the second question we've been looking at is which LA services, so local authority services, might be most suitable to develop as a user-centered digital exemplar service. So where do we see the biggest opportunities there to develop an exemplar? I will now pass on to Henry, and we will have a chance to ask questions at the end of both the sections on these 2 questions. So do think about any questions that you might have, and we'll come to those at the end of the section. I'll now pass on to Henry.
Great, thanks, Henry. So in this work, we've been looking at shared or common technology across Wales. And specifically, we've really been looking at software. So where is that common software? Where's that shared software in use? So next slide, please. The two places we've been looking at kind of two ways that organisations in Wales end up using the same software. We've split these into two categories. The first is shared software. So that's when people make that conscious choice to work together to use the same software. They might do that either by developing a system once for Wales, or they might have procured something together and are either using kind of one nationally hosted instance or have procured together but then implemented local applications. So that shared software is making that conscious choice to use the same piece of software. The other side of the coin is this phrase we're terming common software. So where people have either by accident maybe or through kind of very, very popular vendors in the market ended up using the same vendors completely separately. So where there are kind of maybe several vendors and we're not procuring together, but everyone's using the same software package, might not even be aware that they're using the same software package. So some examples of this might be SYN's by ESS, Uniform by IDOCS, and CETO by Civica, but we'll go on in a little bit more to talk about some examples later on. Next slide, please. So what did we do next? Once we got that problem and we'd split the problem into two, we went out and gathered a lot more data. So we gathered data. We now have knowledge on about 285 systems being used across public services. And if you filled in one of our surveys that we sent out by email, thank you very much. So we've done an email survey to 32 organisations we've already spoken to. We've done some systems investigations. We've looked at websites. We've maybe done inspected elements. We've had a look behind the scenes to see what software is being run. We've looked at FOI requests, so where people have asked organisations before, what software are you running? We've used that where we maybe haven't had responses, we haven't talked to organisations before. We've supplemented that with engagement meetings. So where we've talked to organisations, we've gone out and we've said things like, what did you think of this shared software? Or maybe why aren't you sharing software? So in this phase, we've been able to ask some deeper questions about that. We've also been able to look back at our notes from before and see what people's attitudes have been to shared or common software that we know of already. Next slide, please. So as always with our review, we've split up our findings into three areas. The first of those is in health and care. And in a sentence, what we found is we've got a continued push for this once for Wales technique of developing a piece of software once and then asking local organisations, in this case health boards and NHS trusts, to deploy that locally. We found that this hasn't always been popular and really kind of in more detail, there's this strong push and although this software is being used by most, but I should stress not all health boards, nationally provided software, there is kind of differences in how it's used between health boards. There maybe isn't a full transparency about what choices are being made and what features are being prioritized. There's duplication of features between some of these systems. And mostly what we've heard loud and clear from health boards is that they're crying out to be able to do these integrations themselves, access to the APIs, access to the data, so that they can feed into these systems in a standardized way, but also get data back out of these systems in a standardized way, meaning that we have, as clinicians, have one true source of truth for the patients they're treating to kind of deliver that patient-centered care. Next slide, please. In local government, we found almost a completely different picture. So whereas health and care was all about that shared software, local government was all about common software. We found vendors we're calling primary vendors, where there's one vendor who is extremely popular in the market above others. And we found, though, that even though these exist, doing that procurement together can be rare. And we found some good evidence, though, that there is kind of a scene developing where some in-house developed software is being supplied by one local authority to another. So as an example of this, we found that Teacher Centre, which is sort of provides some of the features of SIMS, which was developed by Ceredigion, was being used by Caerphilly. So we're finding that there is some evidence that this kind of developing in-house and sharing is happening. But the main finding we had was that there's lots of these kind of very, very popular vendors where there's kind of, they are popular above and beyond anyone else, and they're very highly used. and that those aren't being shared, even where there's kind of shared IT service providers, for example, in SRS. Next slide, please. And finally, we looked at sponsor bodies, and as you might expect, because of the difference in kind of lines of business between those different sponsor bodies, those different purposes, the sharing was relatively uncommon, but we found that they were very high users of the cloud, whereas local authorities, to contrast, there was a lot of those key systems were running in local on-premise data centers. And in these sponsor bodies, we found that they were making good use of Microsoft applications, and we also found that there was kind of some evidence of sharing IT resources or outsourcing some services, but little evidence really of sharing those systems, which is something that we expected. Next slide, please, Harry. And just to give you an idea of the sort of data that we collected, what we did was we took each of those key systems we'd gathered data on, and we categorized it into 3 different market types. That primary supplier style market, so for example here, Modern Gov by Civica, used for management of council democracy, where there's one very popular supplier above all others. A popular market where there's maybe 2 or 3 popular suppliers, and then maybe a longer tail of less popular ones. And then a fragmented market where we didn't see more than 1 or 2 organizations using each type of software. So this is the sort of data that we have access to. I'm not going to delve into a lot of the detail now, but happy to answer questions on it. Henry, next slide, please. So at this point, I'll pause and see if maybe there are any questions on what we found about that use of either shared technology or common technology across Wales. Warren.
Hi, that's really interesting. I wondered, in your analysis, do you have information about how open these systems or software is in terms of the availability of APIs, or willingness, I suppose, and or also a willingness of the vendors to look into that where perhaps there aren't open interfaces?
So I would say that it kind of splits into 2 places. So although they are like nationally provided systems which are clearly using APIs to draw data into them, those APIs just aren't being made available to the local health boards. So that's the kind of scene really in health and care. So systems like the Welsh Clinical Portal and WCCIS, the community care system, it's basically impossible to draw information out of them or get information into them. Although APIs do exist, it's just that the local organizations don't have access to those. That's the situation in health and care. Within local authorities, what we tended to find was that these systems that were being purchased for these key systems didn't really have open interfaces, and that's what we were told, and that you could get integrations made between the system that you were buying and other systems, but it was going to cost you. So essentially, you know, buying those integrations, it was a case of going to the supplier and saying, I want this to integrate with this. How much is it going to cost me? And you know, we found that could be quite expensive, and several organizations did mention to us, well, we would like to integrate it, but buying all of these integrations is just too expensive.
Thank you.
Any more questions on kind of common or shared technology before Darren?
Was there any sense from the people you spoke to that they're in a captive market? Having previously worked for a local authority, there are basically 4 vendors because some of the systems are so specialized. Like there's a reason that everybody uses Modern Gov or Express for elections, because there is no other product quite often. What was that a source of frustration for people?
I think certainly, and Roshan will talk about it a bit later. To give an example that ties in nicely, revenues and benefits, for example, is a market where you describe, Darren, there's kind of 3 vendors, and you know, those are kind of Civica, NEC, formerly Northgate, and Capita, and I think kind of based on what we've heard, and based on kind of other work that's been done on transforming and replacing these systems in England, these are not popular systems. They're quite old legacy technology, and they're not very easy to use. they don't integrate well with things. But as you say, there are only those suppliers on offer, and it can make it very hard to move away from those. So I think certainly a desire for something better, or for what they currently have to be better. But yeah, as you described, kind of vendor lock-in is a real issue.
There's a question from Ellen S in the chat, which is there a preferred approach from common or shared technology, or is there a place for both? I think I might go first and then maybe go to Henry. So I don't think that we would advocate for a kind of one size fits all. I think it really does depend on the situation. And I think, there's also something about the current state and kind of how easy it is to move away from what's currently happening. But I think what we've seen is that on both sides, there are definitely ways to leverage the benefits of either of those situations, and working with other people, either that you're sharing software with, or working with other organizations that are benefiting from the same common technology. And that could be working together with partners to advocate for particular feature changes, or it could be defining the data standards so that you can all work together more closely with shared technology. So I think what we want is to understand where these two kind of archetypes are in place, and then be able to kind of advocate for getting all of the benefits of either of them. Henry, would you add anything to that?
I think the only thing I'd add is that the really kind of the core message is that the software that is in use is good when it's based on asking users what they want, testing it with users, doing that user-centered design. And it doesn't matter whether it's maybe shared or it's kind of common. If there's a common system that's in use, and the reason why it's wildly popular is it's really easy to use, it's kind of they've got fantastic support in place, and users are happy with it, then that's very different from kind of we're using it because we have to, but we don't like the fact that we have to use it. And the same in the shared space, where there are kind of shared solutions like the library system. That's been delivered once for everyone, and it's been, we've heard that it's been popular with kind of IT leads, and because it is based on understanding what the users need and then making sure that it's delivered in a way that meets those user needs, then that's what the kind of core of it is. And each of these archetypes needs a slightly different way of dealing with it to be able to get to that stage where users are happy, but that's the end state we'd like. And it doesn't really matter which of these approaches you follow, so long as they're done well. Great. I don't think we have any more questions, Henry, so I'll pass back to you.
Yes, I will actually immediately pass on to Roshan to talk about exemplar local authority services.
Great. Thanks, Henry. So I will be talking about our recommendations from the local authority side of this piece of work, where we've been answering the key question, that is, what are the high impact services or service areas in local authorities that CDPS could potentially help to support transformation into exemplar services, and what are their main challenges? So if we just go to the next slide, I will tell you that we have built on our alpha and beta findings, where we long listed and iterated all the services that local authorities in Wales typically provide. We estimated the volume of user journeys or transactions and their level of profile to citizens, coming out with a short list of high impact service areas that we refined with digital leaders in councils. And these include services which have been grouped into areas such as housing, planning, revenues and benefits, or revs and bens, school enrollment, social care, street and highway maintenance, and waste collection. And as you can see, we've added in a few examples of some of the key high volume services for each of those. Going ahead then, we used 4 key criteria to identify which service areas could be the most suitable for CDPS to support in transforming into exemplars. So firstly, we've considered feasibility, which is based on both complexity and scalability. So by complexity, we've considered how difficult it would be to deliver a service piece, to help embed user-centered design and testing, and whether there are actually successful case studies of transformation that has happened elsewhere in the UK particularly in local government, which CDPS could draw from in a potential future project. With scalability, we've considered how variable the service design is across different councils and whether it would be straightforward to apply support packages or interventions to other councils in Wales and build up a collaborative approach over time. Next, we've considered impact, so that's across both quality of life and in terms of service volume. For the former, we've considered whether transformation would have a significant impact on the quality of life of individuals benefiting from the service. And with volume, we've drawn from our data on users and transactions to really understand how many experience we could improve for those accessing services in Wales. So moving on then to our actual outcomes from evaluating the service areas against those criteria and the sub-criteria underneath that, we found that revs and bends was a clear strongest exemplar from our options appraisal. Secondly, street and highway maintenance performed second best, scoring particularly high on feasibility. We've noted that waste collection and housing, as you can see in the middle there, scored well on both measures alongside street and highway maintenance, while social care actually scored very well on impact, which I think you might expect, whereas it did do a bit more poorly on feasibility. And finally, school enrollment and planning scored relatively poorly compared to the others on both of those measures. And I think we'd also just want to point out that within each of those service areas, there will be a contrast between some of the potential easy wins or low-hanging fruit areas which you could transform more easily versus the more complex areas. And so the example I would pick out is within housing services. On the one hand, you have housing repairs, which is actually relatively similar to street and highway maintenance. And that might be a bit more straightforward or feasible compared to housing support, which actually is a service area for people applying for council or social housing, or helping refer homeless people in centres on to receive support. That's a much more complex problem space. So based on our scoring, as well as our broader evidence base, we've recommended revs and bends and street and highway maintenance as being the first priorities for exemplars for CDPS. So if we just jump ahead to the next slide, firstly for revs and bends services, which include things like pay your council tax or apply for a cost of living payment, they clearly scored the highest in our evaluation. And just looking at our evidence, we would recommend this area, firstly because many key revs and bends services are relatively straightforward in terms of the complexity of user journeys and the number of different organizations involved in service delivery. Secondly, as there is really strong interest from councils across Wales to improve these services, we think there is a stronger opportunity to provide similar transformation support in a few councils and sort of build up that coalition over time. Thirdly, several local authorities referred to these services as a high priority for transformation because they can significantly impact the lives of citizens who are struggling to access support or they're unaware that they're actually eligible for it. And finally, we estimate that there are over 3 million transactions involved in key revs and bends services every year in Wales. And even supporting a single council has the potential to positively impact quite a high volume of user journeys for a local population. So we really see there's an opportunity to support transformation of revs and bends and showcase how shifting from PDFs to more accessible online forms, integration of back-end systems and better use of data can really deliver a smarter service for users in both running or accessing services. Secondly, if we just go on to our other recommendation, which is for street and highway services such as report a pothole or report a broken street light, which also scored well in our evaluation. So firstly, we recommend it because it's a source of frustration for lots of citizens and is the cause of a lot of calls and emails to the customer contact centres for councils from citizens who are chasing up their requests or are frustrated and don't know what's happening with their reports. We've also found that the service design is relatively similar across councils compared to some of the other service areas, and that would hopefully make it a bit more straightforward to provide similar support to multiple different LAs. We think street and highway maintenance as an exemplar would be particularly good because it would also serve as an exemplar for the wider group of reporter problem services across other service areas, such as housing repairs. And finally, we believe that there has been less of a previous focus on this area than others, such as waste collection. And this area is ripe for transformation to tackle digital challenges around manual case management approaches, online forms, and digital skills gaps, which CDPS could potentially support. So that brings us to the end of our main recommendations, and we'd love to hear any questions on our process of data gathering and evaluation, our findings, or those recommendations. Oh, sorry, Henry, I was just going to say, just from quickly reading the chat, yeah, thank you for those contributions. And as part of our sort of more detailed outputs around this, we've really gone through and looked for case studies for where there have been transformations, so we can definitely feed those into our findings. Warren.
Hi, thanks. That's fascinating. I wasn't surprised that Reverend Benz is up on the top of the list, and I'm delighted. But I think in sort of prioritizing those, do you also have a sense of who could be the kind of sponsoring teams who might back that as potential exemplars that you could work with?
Yeah, so as part of the process that we've gone through, we've taken a look at the different local authorities who we've heard from, both in terms of the challenges that they've talked about, what potential blockers to actually improving or transforming their services might be, and finally just a sense of that appetite and prioritization of that specific area. So if it's Revs and Bens, which councils have actually said, you know, Revs and Bens is a really high priority for them. And so we have sort of collected that and put forwards for the different service areas a few councils who we think it would be great to just start exploring that conversation with, and to better understand what their actual challenges and end-to-end user journeys look like if CDPS was to sort of pick up one of these service area cases and take it forwards at some point in its future.
Great, thanks.
Great. Darren?
Just quick, and in recommending these two areas, are you looking at the end-to-end service? So both resident and officer to manage council tax or to manage a complaint, whatever, or are you just looking at a resident-facing service to report it in the first instance?
So we've definitely considered that broader end-to-end user journey. And so in mapping out some of the challenges in more detail, we've tried to both include what the impacts on the actual residents might be. So thinking about, for example, like the front end with those online forms, or whether they're getting updates on their cases or not. And then on the back end, detailing what some of the problems we've heard of from service owners. So as part of our process in the last two phases, we've spoken to both digital leaders who are very much kind of leading strategically for local authorities, and then we've also met at the next level down specific service owners or leads or service managers to understand like what are their pain points for their teams and for themselves in running the services. So we've tried to capture both sides of that when we've been doing this evaluation and detailing of what the challenges and problem spaces are. Great. And I'd also say thank you to Ellen as well, who's posted in the chat about Powers's experiences as well. And I know that we've partly captured that as well in our findings. But yeah, it's a good example of how actually for a lot of these service areas across the board, you see some local authorities who have managed to get a bit further ahead and are showing best practice, and a few of the other councils who maybe would love to hear a bit more about how they can move forwards. They might be a bit more behind in a specific service area. So clearly there's a lot of opportunity to just join up different teams and share knowledge across Wales compared to how things are being done at the moment, which can often be a bit more siloed. Great.
Thank you, Roshan. I think if we've got no more questions for now, I will go on and we will have a bit of time at the end if anyone thinks of anything before then. So really to wrap up the show and tell, but also to an extent, this kind of iteration of the landscape review. So as I said at the beginning, this is our final week, having been through a few different phases and looked at many different areas of public services, but also a few different particular problems that we've been asked to look into. I thought we'd just talk about kind of next steps and how the findings of the landscape review are being used. So thinking back to the main output of the beta phase of the landscape review, which is what we've been working on since January, a couple of, or maybe the last show, I think the last public show and tell, we talked about some investment cases that we'd recommended being taken forward, not just within CDPS, but kind of significant shared challenges that we think that we should be working together to solve. And Roshan has just talked about some of the examples. So things such as how we do great publishing of digital content and digital services, also how we manage great case management in the back end of our services, both making it seamless for service owners to deliver and run their services, but also ensuring that users are able to know kind of where their cases have got to as they're moving through these kind of complex systems. So of those 7 investment cases, 2 of them have been handed over from the landscape review team directly to other teams within CDPS. So those 2 are procurement with a team, with some members of the team on this call today, but also a team looking at digital maturity and health and thinking about how we engage with health organizations and support them on digital transformation. And then the remaining 5 that we've recommended that we want to work on in this Senedd term have gone into CDPS's portfolio, and they are moving through the prioritization process as we think about when to kind of pull those out and take them forward actively. In terms of the broader findings from the landscape review, so we've spoken again to a huge number of services and a huge number of organizations, and we're incredibly grateful for all of that input. It's given us a huge amount of data and intelligence about how digital services are currently being delivered, and all of that is being fed into CDPS's current projects and how we engage with our partners. Quite practically, one of the third thing that we've done over the last 6 weeks is to make a static wiki within CDPS, which pulls together all of that data and information that we've gathered so that other teams can benefit from it, be that other delivery teams or be that our standards or skills teams. So they are able to benefit from all of the things that people have told us. In terms of just sharing our findings, so we have been sharing our findings through these show and tells as we go. And if anyone missed any of those, there will be a link at the end to go on YouTube and see some of those past show and tells. But wrapping up the beta phase, we will also be publishing 2 blog posts in the next few weeks, which give a bit more of the detail about the content that we've covered. So the first one will talk about those 7 investment cases in more detail and what we found on them and why we've put them forward. And then the second blog post will focus more on the things that we've talked about today. So both wrapping up our data, but also those 2 more specific questions around shared and common technology, and then around LA exemplar services. So do look out for those as they come out. Finally, just thank you everyone on this call, but also people maybe who will view this in the future. Thank you to everyone who has spoken to us and shared their time and expertise. It has been incredibly valuable to CDPS, and that's already being fed into the projects we're doing, but we're sure that it will continue to have an impact in the future. This is then the end of this iteration of the landscape review, but we think it's quite likely that we'll return to the landscape in the future, potentially in a year's time, when we want to understand kind of how the digital services and digital maturity of organizations has changed in order to evolve how we're engaging with our partners as well. So finally, just before we come to the final wrap up, does anyone have any questions either on the things we presented today or any more general questions? Okay, if there are no questions, I will just quickly wrap up. So as I mentioned, we do have all of our previous show and tells through all of those different phases available on YouTube, as well as the blog posts that we previously published. So do take a look at those. Alternatively, if anyone would like to get in touch with the team, do feel free to get in touch this week, and then we will let people know how to get in touch and kind of benefit from our knowledge in the future as well. So I think that's it. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for coming today, and I hope you will have good Tuesdays. Bye all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.